Today we have the Sigma 50mm f1.4 DGDN, a brand new lens from Sigma designed specifically for mirrorless systems. And today we're going to see what it can do. This is Ian from MPB, and we've come to lovely, sunny Lewes here in East Sussex to take a closer look at the Sigma 50mm f1.4 DGDN. This lens shares almost exactly the same name as the previous lens from Sigma, the previous 50mm f1.4, but this lens is actually brand new for mirrorless systems. So the original Sigma 50mm f1.4 was designed primarily with DSLR systems in mind. When mirrorless came into play, it actually meant that lens designers, including Sigma, could design lenses with much less compromise. So that means higher sharpness and higher image quality from edge to edge. This lens is really different to the old one, not just in terms of its aesthetic construction, but also in terms of its optical construction. Now, this lens has 14 elements in 11 groups. Now, 3 of those elements are actually aspherical. Aspherical elements are actually really important in lens design, primarily to stop things like aberrations, distortions, and other unwanted image traits. So we have the new Sigma 50mm f1.4 mounted on a Panasonic S1R, and we have the old Sigma 50mm mounted on a Sony A7R5. Now, the reason for that is quite simple. We could only get the new lens in L mounts. However, we know that the majority of people are likely to use the new lens on a Sony type system, so that's why we chose this system. And Amy here, she has the Sony 50mm f1.4 ZE. So we're largely using this lens as a bit of a control or a benchmark part of the test. So we're here in Birling Gap on the East Sussex coast. We literally couldn't resist coming down here on such a beautiful day to see how the Sigma would actually render this beautiful scene. We have both Sigmas side by side. Old one here and the new one here. And just from holding it up like this, you can tell the older one, it's a lot longer. The reason for that is that, as I said before, the old Sigma lens was designed primarily around the DSLR system. So in order to make it compatible natively to E-mount cameras like the Sony, for example, they had to add this extra flange here, which effectively is just, I guess, a mount converter, but obviously they've covered it up to make it look nice. But obviously this new lens does not need that because this one was designed from the ground up to be specifically for mirrorless cameras. Just from holding them, I can already feel that the old one actually weighs a lot more, and that is confirmed by the specs. The specs tells us that an L-mount version of the old one would weigh about 909 grams, and this one here weighs 660. So you're basically losing 200 grams by not having that extra kind of mount here, so already a lighter lens. The old one has a 77mm filter thread, whereas the new one has a 72mm filter thread. So 77 for me is pretty handy in order to convert downwards from that. 72 is a little bit awkward, but again, it's not the end of the world. One of the things that has changed from the old lens is the fact that they've actually got rid of the focus indicators as on the old lens. That's completely gone on this one. Moving on to the side, the old one has just one button or one switch, which is the AF or MF switch, whereas the new lens has that same switch, autofocus or manual focus. It also has autofocus lock, and it also has a way to declick or click on the aperture ring. So the aperture ring, quite simply put, the new one has one and the old one hasn't. And to be frank, I absolutely love an aperture ring. And for those people that will be shooting this lens on a Sony system and who already own a few Sony G lenses, for example, or GM lenses, should I say, this is going to feel so intuitive. There's something really, really nice about operating, or should I say, changing your aperture through an aperture ring. As you can probably see, the older lens is longer than the new one, so it means that it hangs over more, so more of the weight is kind of distributed towards the front of the unit, of the camera and lens combination. So it's going to feel a little bit more cumbersome, whereas something like this is lighter, so it means that it's trying to balance its way backwards, and that to me just means more comfort. If you're a videographer, for example, and you're planning on using one of these lenses on a gimbal, then I know which one I'd want to choose: the more compact and lighter weight lens with better balance. It's been an extremely bright day today, and this lens, being an f1.4, is begging to be shot at night. But we've already thought of that, so Amy and I went into Lewis to see how this lens performs in low light. So I've had a chance to look at the images that we've shot over the last couple of days on the new Sigma 50mm f1.4 DGDN, as well as the two other lenses that we tested as well. And frankly, I'm astounded as to how well this lens performed. At f1.4, it is incredibly sharp. Is it as sharp at f1.4 as it is at f8? No, it isn't, but very, very few lenses actually are. However, the difference between f1.4 and f8 is greatly reduced compared to the old lens. Before we conducted this test, I'd personally used the Sigma 50mm f1.4, the original one, a few times, and I never had a problem using it at f1.4, and I did expect certain aberrations and also some of the color fringes associated with shooting a lens at f1.4. Now with this lens, all that is much reduced. However, you still retain some of the dreaminess associated with shooting fully open. One of my favorite things about using a 50mm lens is that it can also be used as a landscape lens. And sometimes I find that actually shooting a landscape fully open creates a certain dreaminess. And this lens is amazing at doing that. Because of that extra sharpness that you get fully open, you're able to still create an image that is very sharp, but it has a certain dreaminess that I can't really explain. And that is something that can only be achieved when the lens is performing this well fully open. Now, I would see myself as a real-world reviewer. Rather than looking at charts and graphs, I much prefer to do my reviews based upon the images that I see coming back at me on my screen. But at the same time, I also know how hard it is for a lens to resolve a modern high-resolution sensor, such as the one on the S1R. I don't think there was a single image from this review where I felt that this lens wasn't resolving the resolution that this camera provides. So we really wanted to get some stellar shots for you at f1.4 to show you what that bokeh was on this lens. But sadly the weather was against us and we had the most horrible and torrential rain that evening. However, we did manage to get a couple of shots. And to be honest with you, when I first reviewed them on the back of the screen, I was astounded as to how incredible they were. The bokeh was round, it was consistent, and it had none of that kind of onion ring effect that you get in many of the lenses. And I think that's just thanks to the 11 rounded aperture blades you get inside this lens. So there are some things that I think I would change overall on this new lens. The first thing is I didn't really like the omission of the focus scales on this lens compared to the previous one. Now I'm a bit old school, I still shoot a lot of film, and I think I do find the focus scales to be quite helpful sometimes. Saying that, this is an autofocus camera primarily, and most people will use it as such, so I think that is a minor point. The second thing would be the reduced 72mm filter thread. However, again, that is not a huge deal. You can just use a step-down ring to actually use all your old 77mm filters. But there is plenty I love about this lens in terms of design. The first one being the aperture dial being on the lens. That is something that I'm a huge fan of. It is very intuitive to actually hold the lens and actually be able to change the aperture dial right there on the lens. And that works beautifully in tandem with a clickable off and on switch for the aperture. So it means that you can either have it stepped if you're holding the camera to your eye and actually feel the individual stops, or you can have it really easy and free-flowing, which also works really well for videographers. But by far the most important thing about this lens, of course, is the image quality. It isn't just a lens that resolves higher resolutions and is sharp all over. It is a lens that has a personality and actually creates really beautiful images. If you have any questions at all about the lens or anything we talked about in the review, please put them in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more reviews, we're going to be doing tons more over the coming months. So please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel.